This is the Fearless Experience with Brendan P. Keegan. Conversations with leaders who provide valuable, candid insights from their journeys and share their secrets to what made them successful and fearless.
My guest today is George Mattson, CEO of Wheels Up, a leading provider of private aviation across the entire globe. Now, George today brings to us over 25 years of leadership experience, starting at IBM, moving on to Goldman Sachs. At Goldman Sachs, George served as partner and co-head of their global industrials group for well over a decade. His responsibilities included directing the transportation and airline practices. So well suited for what he's doing now. Hey, George, welcome to the Fearless Leadership Podcast today. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Brendan. Great to be with you.
Hey, so let's start at IBM. So you started your career at IBM, as so many successful people have. My understanding is you started in sales and marketing, and then you pivoted into investment banking, which doesn't seem like, your natural pivot, but that's what we're here to talk about. And you went to Goldman Sachs in their Aviation, Air France, Delta, Wheels Up. Can you tell our audience today how you started at IBM in sales and marketing?
Sure. Brendan, again, thanks for having me on your show. And I'm a huge fan of your program, your book, which I've had an opportunity to read. And so delighted to be here. Yeah, I was recruited to IBM right off the Duke campus. I guess sometime in my senior year, I started to realize that even though I had played tennis in college, I probably wasn't going to be playing tennis much longer. And I should probably think about getting a job. And so I interviewed on campus with IBM for their sales and marketing program, and was fortunate to get a job offer and start in Washington, D.C. Right after I graduated from Duke. I was enamored with IBM for a bunch of reasons, but one of the most important ones is I knew their reputation as a great training ground for people in, I'll just call it the basics of business. And, my first year at IBM, I was literally in a one-year training program about how to be an effective business person. I wouldn't even say salesperson. And I learned the basics of business as a 21-year-old, thanks to IBM. Really taught me how to sell, how to put myself in the shoes of the customer, how to be customer-centric. And one of the things I used to think about, all the different roles I've had in my career and all the different businesses I've become familiar with. All the businesses have the customer at the center as the focus. And I think the opportunity to figure out, literally my first year on the job, how to engage with customers, how to build rapport with customers, is something I've used throughout the rest of my career in every job. Every job, not just technical sales jobs, have an element of selling to them. Whether you're selling a vision, a product, a service, a capability, business is about selling something, and I've benefited from that start all throughout my years, I think.
So it's interesting. So you started at IBM in DC. We're about the same vintage. And I actually started with EDS, another technology company in DC as well. Yep. And I was in their 3-year engineering program. But I have to tell you this, after doing their engineering program, they said, hey, Brennan, you're better with people than technology. And they moved me into sales. And my best friend went to IBM, went into sales right in Manhattan. And I actually called him up and he gave me some IBM sales lessons. And remember one term he used to use, Banta. I don't know if that was something about negotiating, but he used to tell me all that. So also Powerhouse Duke. Okay, we'll get to that. So now we have listeners of all ages. We do have a lot of listeners that are on the emerging leader side, younger side. And one question I know that I get asked, which I want to ask you, is you pivoted kind of from one career to another, from technology, sales and marketing into investment banking. And can you tell some listeners out there that are sitting at an HP and an IBM, at a Dell right now, that would love to go work at a Goldman, a JP Morgan, a CIBC, investment banking, how do you do that? How do you make that pivot?
Yeah, sure. So I've been at IBM for about 4 years. Things were going very well, learning a tremendous amount. But I've always tended, just I guess as part of my personality, to be eager to reach for the next opportunity, to be eager to kind of look around the corner at what the next might be. And I realized I wanted to go to business school. And so I approached IBM and said, hey, I want to go back to business school. I want to leave for a couple of years. And rather than having me leave, IBM offered to send me to the Wharton Executive MBA program in Philadelphia, which I did on the weekends and in the summers. At the time, I was the youngest person to attend that program because it was largely designed for people who were deeper into their careers. I actually drove up to Philadelphia to meet the dean to explain to him why making me wait a year wasn't a great idea, and I managed to convince him. Another, I guess, example of selling. But in business school, I became exposed to a number of classmates from Wall Street. Even when I was coming out of Duke, a number of folks, my classmates, ended up going to Wall Street. And so I was already familiar with it, but I decided to make the transition after graduating and was really fascinated with what the role of a big Wall Street firm like Goldman Sachs was in the world. Capital formation, shareholder value creation, helping companies think through and evaluate strategic transactions. And, ended up spending 20 years at Goldman Sachs. And I think I probably crammed 50 years of experience and knowledge into 20 years, but it was just an incredible learning ground for everything I've done sort of then and since.
So I think one of my takeaways from listening to you is you kind of used grad school as like a pivot point. You got to meet different people, you got to build different skills, you built a network where a lot of the people were driving down from New York and Wall Street. You were driving up from DC, and you really leverage that. So, if you're thinking of making that transition, you're hearing somebody who's made it talk about, going back to school and education, and then building a network that's not natural to what you would have built while you were at IBM. So let's go back to the Duke campus, electrical engineering major. So I went to RPI and engineering school. EE, I think, was considered one of the toughest majors. So you picked a really tough major. What were you like on campus at Duke? Tell us, and probably don't tell us everything, but give us the George on the Duke campus.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was a typical kid. I had grown up, traveling and living in different places around the world. I actually had gone to high school in Athens, Greece. And so I kind of showed up from Greece, and I was a pretty relaxed kid. I loved sports. I played 4 different sports through high school and then played college tennis. So I really had 2 majors at Duke. I'm not sure if electrical engineering was the harder one or tennis was, but I had 2 majors. I was super busy. I learned a lot in those years, Brendan, about juggling, multitasking, being organized, being disciplined. I lost a lot more than I won. So I learned about losing. I learned about dusting myself off and getting a little bit better the next day. As far as engineering is concerned, my dad encouraged me to study engineering, and it was I remember it being a pretty simple conversation. I knew I never really had a plan to be a practicing engineer, but he said, look, it's a big commitment to go to school, get something out of it. You're good at math and science. You'll be able to get a job afterwards. People will think you're smart if you tell them you're an electrical engineer. It's always better to make a good first impression. And most importantly, it'll teach you how to analyze and solve problems. And I think particularly on that last one, he was really onto something. And as I think about it, I've never been a practicing engineer, although I obviously worked in sales at a technology company. But the process you learn of analyzing problems, being a systems thinker, unpacking a problem, looking at it from different perspectives, thinking about statistical outcomes and probabilities attached to different courses of action. I realized as I went through my career that I looked at things a little bit differently than people who perhaps didn't have that experience. And I found it to be very effective, not just in the context of, the content of engineering, but even sitting or standing at a board meeting. When I was at Goldman Sachs and someone says, well, what do you think we should do? And you walk through the considerations, the facts, how to assess it, what the recommended course of action might be, what alternative courses of action that you're not recommending might have been. And that whole process of analyzing problems and being a systems thinker, I really stemmed out of engineering, which wasn't easy to get through, by the way. But I'm glad I stuck with it, and I think got a lot out of it.
So right now I feel like I'm looking in the mirror in this conversation, and I think you and I could be like doing advertisement
doppelganger,
for taking like technical degrees. Because I went to RPI in engineering school. I didn't get an engineering degree, but I took almost as much math as the engineering majors. Took a lot of stats. And, a lot of times people say, Brendan, you just have this way of looking at a problem and solving it. And I go back to the analytical approach. It's sort of like a puzzle. You do the outside pieces, you get the corner pieces, you build to the middle, and you kind of feel like every problem has a solution. I think that's one of the things you take away. And I espouse that a lot, especially when I'm talking to people and they're trying to decide what majors is. I say, like that really has helped me, even though I've actually never used the actual application of the courses. I've used the conceptual, the theoretical, the thinking, the critical thinking skills that it gave. So now you said something interesting. You came from Athens, Greece. So now you don't look European, you look American. And if I remember right, your dad was a foreign service national and you moved a number of times. You got a chance to see like all parts of the world. I believe from reading your background, you went to 6 different schools before you settled into Duke. So, what did that play into going into aviation? Was it you were on planes as a young kid, or how did all that come together?
Yeah, I had a pretty unusual and I think very unique childhood. My dad, as you mentioned, Brendan, was a career foreign service officer, worked in the State Department, worked in embassies around the world. We would move every 1, 2, or 3 years to a different country or back to Washington. And so I went to 6 schools, lived in different places in Europe and Africa, first and second grade in Lisbon, third grade in DC, fourth and fifth grade in Nairobi, 6th and 7th grade in the Seychelles, back to DC, and then high school in Athens, Greece. And then he continued on with his career as I went to college. But, it taught me to appreciate, and look, I think that kind of upbringing can go one of 2 ways. Either you really love it and you recognize as you're going through it as a kid, the unique privilege you have to see so much of the world at such a young age and get a perspective like that. Or you really don't like it much and it's hard, right? Because you're constantly changing, you're constantly being uprooted. But I fortunately fell into the former category. And look, I realized as I was going through it that it had pros and cons. You're constantly leaving people. You're constantly needing to make new friends. You're missing things you had gotten used to and so on. But what it really, and maybe because I lived so many places, I ended up in aviation, right? But ultimately, I think what it taught me early on is how to embrace change, how to be adaptable, how to fit into new environments, and how to sort of take with you what you benefited from and learned from the last experience into the next experience. And I love ever-changing situations. Staticness, I feel uncomfortable with. Feeling too comfortable feels uncomfortable, actually. And so I think at the same time, I've stayed multiple years, many years, almost 20 in the case of my Goldman Sachs chapter, in the same place. So I'm not suggesting that I'm a person or that it's the best approach to sort of bounce from one thing to the next every quarter, every month, every year. But there's an element of newness and freshness and learning and experiencing new things that I found myself running toward, and I think some people in life find less comfortable. And so I think that's a lot of what I learned as I was going through that childhood, and probably explains A, the industry I ended up in, and B, some of the transitions I've made through my career.
So I got to tell you that's where our similarities just like diverged. We just hit a fork in the road. I still remember my first flight was I was 21. I was going on a plant tour of Michelin Tire in South Carolina, and I got a cab from Troy, New York, over to Albany Airport. I got on the plane, and it was January, and now they were de-icing it, but I didn't know what de-icing was. So I look out my window and I go, "Wow, I'm impressed. They wash the plane before every flight." And it's funny to think of that now, because like now I've been on, in my career, so many flights, and I'm like, I can't believe I actually thought they were washing the plane before they took off for aerodynamic purposes. But okay, so let's talk about your careers. Goldman Sachs, 20 years. When you were there, you got to see probably hundreds of companies, transactions. That's one of the beauties of getting in that type of role, all the way through Delta Airlines and Wheels Up. What leadership experiences would you say have kind of shaped your leadership philosophy now as a CEO?
Yeah. Well, as I said, Brendan, I think I was just so fortunate to be there, and you have this sort of front row seat to just an incredible breadth of experiences with, as you said, hundreds of companies, hundreds of CEOs, boards. It's an apprenticeship-based kind of process. You get sort of thrown into this environment, high octane environment. But over the course of not too long, you start to recognize patterns. You start to see things you've seen before. It's this whole idea of experience base, of the importance of an experience base. And so I just came to learn that there are many different organizational cultures and leadership styles, but there are certain fundamental qualities you always saw in effective leaders and effective organizations, right? The ability to be authentic, the ability to be transparent, to communicate a clarity of mission and purpose, to create open space for constructive discussion and debate, to learn by listening more than talking, allowing room for failure, learning, getting a little bit better every day. These are things that I watched people do and sort of tried to draw out the best in what I saw in so many different talented executives I had a chance to work with, and so many great mentors I had a chance to benefit from having over the course of those years. But that in of itself doesn't really teach you, in my opinion, what you need to know about leadership. And leadership is, I think you certainly have some people have innate qualities that lend themselves toward being good leaders, but at the end of the day, you have to learn to be a good leader. And I remember, I was a few years into my career at Goldman Sachs. I was doing very well up to that point. I was a strong individual contributor. And that's what I was focused on, my individual performance, my individual contribution, how I could, be better, do more. And a mentor of mine sat me down and he explained to me that as good as I was, or thought I was, if I wanted to maximize my potential, I was going to need to learn to be a leader, which meant focusing less on my individual contributions and learning to make the people around me better and measure my success through the collective success, not just my individual role. And I remember it being kind of a key moment where my thinking started to shift to a different paradigm. No one's first job is a leadership job. They don't hire you off campus and say, hey, we want you to be in charge of XYZ. So you learn it later. And it's an evolution from being an individual contributor to being a leader. Leaders evolve out of individual contributor roles. And it's not something that's necessarily innate for everybody. It wasn't innate for me, but I was fortunate to have a lot of mentors, as I said, who helped me through that transition. And as I think about how I spend my time today, a small amount of it is my individual contribution. I'd say the largest amount of the time I spend is in my role with the team, working on building the best team. You can't have the best company if you don't have the best team. And then helping organize that and incent it in a way for that complex organism called a team to be most effective. And it involves investing in people. It involves taking the time. If you're a type A person who's juggling balls, multitasking, trying to get as much done in an hour as possible, the idea of sitting down with somebody and talking to them for 20 minutes or an hour to get to know them, to figure out how to best leverage their skills, that's not something that's natural. It feels like almost you're slowing the process down, but it's actually the most important thing you do. And so today, I spend the vast majority of my time with my team or with my customers, direct reports, and also skip level meetings. I love meeting with people who don't report to me, who are 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever levels down in the organization. I learn the most from those folks and from customers. And it really creates the view you have of your business and where you need to focus your time is that time you spend building, working with, coaching, and mentoring the team.
So, one thing, if I look back through our conversation over the last 15, 20 minutes, there's a theme coming out where every environment you're in, you're focused on learning. So I don't know if you're believe in lifelong learning, but you talked about in engineering, you didn't use the electrical engineering, but you used the learning, the concepts. You talked about your different positions you had. You talked about what you took away. You talked about moving 6 times and not looking at it as a negative, but how could you adapt and learn from it? So I think that's a real hallmark of your leadership is that, you're continuing to learn. But it's interesting, your mentor, and I want to talk about mentors in a minute because I think they have a real impact. but you talked about, how your mentor kind of talked about individual versus leader. I remember one of my mentors sitting me down, and I was similar to you, but my mentor I don't think was as nice as yours might have been. And I remember he said, Brendan, you have the IQ to go do anything you want, but you don't have the EQ. It's not about you. It's not about your team. It's about, having more empathy for other people in the company and different things. And at the time I was sort of like, man, I'm killing it. Like what's he bringing me down for? But what I realized is he was actually trying to build me up so that I could lead broad, diverse groups and really be more empathetic. Earlier you said, listen more than you talk. And when I talk to young groups of people, I always tell them, you probably have enough IQ right now to go do whatever you want. But it's the EQ. Do you know how to read the room? Are you self-aware? Do you know what you need to work on? And do you know what the people around you need? Sometimes even though someone really, you should probably, like put them in a headlock because they're not performing well. Maybe that's the opposite of what they actually need. So I found that interesting, but let's jump into mentoring for a minute. So you've had mentors, like what advice would you give to somebody out there that doesn't have a mentor right now?
Yeah, look, I think mentors and learning from people's experiences is the most important thing you can do to develop your own career. And this is my experience, Brendan. Mentors typically haven't come from traditional mentor programs. Person A is assigned to mentor person B. These things are organic; they happen naturally. And they may not even be people who you work directly with, but they're somewhere else in the organization or they're outside of your organization. But I would just encourage anybody listening to recognize and acknowledge the importance of mentorship, to be mentored and to mentor, and to seek those relationships and opportunities out. It can be as rewarding, if not more rewarding, frankly, to mentor somebody than to be mentored. And so, really, really important. And it's not always obvious in the moment that it's helping you, but those relationships last a long time. And I think we can all think back on people who had a particular impact at a particular moment in time, said something which they might have even thought was not particularly insightful or relevant, but stuck with you, resonated in some way, and shaped, the direction that you were going to go in. So really important. But I think it also relates to a comment about broadly how to think about one's career. And look, I think it's important that organizations provide pathways and opportunities for people to develop their careers, but nobody is going to own your career development the way you are going to own your own career development. And I think thinking of yourself as being in charge of your career, whether it involves staying at the same company for 25 or 30 or 40 years or moving to multiple opportunities, and to me, it always came back. You mentioned learning, and yeah, I realized early on that the thing that motivated me most was being just intellectually engaged and learning something new that was challenging, not overwhelmingly challenging, but challenging, a little uncomfortable, but something where you could measure progress in developing an element of your capabilities that didn't exist before. And what always caused me to get antsy and think about moving was when I started to feel the slope of my learning flattening. And when slope of my learning starts to flatten, that's when I get uncomfortable. It was interesting. I remember when I decided to take this role here as the CEO of Wheels Up, I sat down with my family. I said I'd sort of been working for myself for 10 or so years, which I think we also share in common, Brendan. And I sat down with my family and I said, look, I'm thinking about going back to work kind of full time. I'm going to be in Atlanta most of the time, and so on and so forth. And one of my kids said, well, okay, Dad, but I mean, like, you don't have to do that. Like, why are you going to do that? You don't have to do that. I said, no, I don't have to do it. I don't have to do it at all, but I want to do it. And the reason I want to do it is I think part of an exciting life's journey, whether it's personal or professional, but professional in this case, is writing more chapters. If you can write more chapters in your book that you're in charge of writing about your career, your life, and those chapters are worth writing and worth reading later as you think back on what you accomplished and achieved, then that's a reason enough. And I looked at this opportunity at Wheels Up. I thought about what would be involved in transforming this company, and I realized that I was going to, even at the ripe old age of well into my 50s, I was going to get back on maybe the steepest part of my learning curve that I've ever been on. And to me, that was incredibly exciting and compelled me to do this.
Yeah, so let's jump into Wheels Up. I see that behind you. It looks like a phenom and a challenger. If
Yep.
I know my planes correctly.
Or your plans.
Yeah. So just tell me what's going on at Wheels Up with you leading the charge now.
So Wheels Up is in the midst of a really, I think, exciting and disruptive transformation in the industry. The company is the fourth largest private aviation provider in the world. Grew very quickly over the span of 10 short years, even more rapidly during COVID, which was a boost to demand in private aviation. When people started flying again, you saw a step change in demand for private aviation, and then ran into some challenges on the backside of COVID as business levels normalized. Delta Airlines came in and made a critical, I'd say, rescue investment into Wheels Up in September, October of 2023. And I stepped off the board of Delta to run the company. And I did it for frankly, one simple reason is I saw an opportunity to create a company in private aviation, or frankly, in aviation, that had never existed before. Meaning that, from the beginning of time when, Wilbur and Orville Wright rolled that plane down the field in Kitty Hawk, commercial aviation sort of sat over here and private aviation sat over here, and the two ecosystems really never connected and touched. And what we're doing through and with our strategic partnership with Delta is we're creating an integrated aviation solutions platform that enables our customers to access through one relationship, private and commercial aviation. And then within private aviation, any form of private aviation that they need, whether it's on fleet with our existing aircraft, like those Phenoms and Challengers in the background, or our global charter business, which is as large as my member-owned operated business here in the United States. So if you think about what we're creating a business that has really three platforms through which it fulfills a customer's aviation solution needs. One is our owned operated member business here in the United States, the aircraft that we have. The second is our global charter business that allows you to access any airplane you need or want, from a single engine turboprop to a giant passenger jet around the world. And then third, through our relationship and the global network of Delta Airlines, the premium commercial airline of the world. And so the idea of creating aviation solutions in an industry that's been very focused on products. When you look at the industry today, Brendan, the vast majority of private aircraft are still wholly owned. Those that are not wholly owned, for the most part, are fractionally owned. So there's an opportunity here to give a customer the tools to basically curate their aviation solution for each trip. So this week it might be, you're sitting in Atlanta, you're going to New York, you're by yourself. Delta has 10 or 12, 15 flights. By all means, take Delta. Next week you're going to your house with your family in Sun Valley, Idaho, and it's hard to get to, and you want to add a day to your holiday, you want to fly on us. You're going to some place in Southern Europe, you fly Delta to the hub gateway city, and then you take your onward journey, the short leg, if you will, on us. This whole idea of aviation solutions and creating tools in customer hands, and back to kind of what I learned at IBM, creating something in a business model that's customer centric, that solves a need, usually works. And that's really the center of our strategy here.
Yeah, I'm going back to, engineering concepts class, where in my head, I've got a little Venn diagram drawn. You got the three circles, you got right in the middle, you got the private aviation, you got the commercial aviation, you got the charter, and you're in the middle sitting there saying, which one is the most efficient? Efficient might be time, efficient might be cost. The example of Idaho, you want to get there, not take, a connection, that's time. You're one person traveling, an hour, its efficiency is money. So, I couldn't help but slip in a little engineering talk there. But now, Kurt Morning, so you're fourth largest. Delta's what, second in commercial aviation? Are they?
Delta is by profits, by market value, the largest, maybe slightly below number one by revenues, but the largest premium commercial carrier in the world. And I mean, to give some context to the potential of this partnership, Delta has 45,000 corporate customers. Those corporate customers, many of them fly private. They either own aircraft or they own fractions of aircraft. They're an opportunity. You think about Delta's loyalty database. You think about 20 million active SkyMiles members. Even if 0.5% of 20 million people can afford to either and maybe do or maybe don't yet fly private, that's 100,000 people. So the size of the addressable market we have in concert with Delta is enormous. A leading strategy consulting firm did a study recently that suggested that 90% of people who can afford to fly private have never flown private. So you think about that, and so you ask yourself a couple of questions. One, well, if that's the case, where are these people? Well, they're sitting in the front of the cabin at places like Delta Airlines. And so a targeted approach of bringing those people, new entrants into the ecosystem, is a key part of our strategy. Then you ask yourself, well, why aren't they flying private if they can afford to? And I think the answer to that is the industry is confusing. It tends to offer pretty rigid, inflexible products. It's hard for people to understand how they should access private aviation, or even if they should. And so we're trying to knock down all of that confusion and make it really simple. Give the tools to the customer, as you said, Brendan, let them choose. You almost hesitate to use the word sensible and private aviation in the same sentence, but we're trying to take the most sensible approach you can take to getting the benefits, which are really buying back your time of utilizing private aviation where and when you need it. Lots of use cases. We've mentioned a few. If you're running a business and you've got to go run around Europe and look at 5 manufacturing plants in 5 countries, that could take you a week, or it could take you 2 days. What's the value of those 3 days for your whole management team? That's the kind of cost benefit analysis that I think you can really attach some structure to and make informed choices. At the end of the day, the value set that each customer uses is different, but we're trying to set up the conversation around that framework, not some of the frameworks that are more typically sort of govern how people think about this mode of travel.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about Delta. Just 2 weeks ago, I was over in London visiting my college senior. She's in Scotland. She's going to investment banking. And so I tell her, hey, let's get all our vacation in now before you start, because it might be a challenge once you start. But hey, I flew Delta over, Delta back, loved it, great service. But as you said, that flexibility, was.
Brendan, we should have talked last week. You could have gone down a set of stairs, jumped on another plane, and been in Scotland an hour later.
That's true. That's true. That's true. I'll have to do that next time. Hey, so a couple last questions for you. When you think about you mentioned you were a Delta board of director, you're an advisor, and now you're stepping into the company. Like, that's another transition. So how do you transition, from advisor to boss to now working in a company? Just give us a little bit more on transitions, because I think that's going to be something that some of our audience takes away from today. You're now back in that operating role. And I loved how your kids were talking to you about that. And I love that you talk to your kids about that. They're probably going to become, good business leaders themselves just from listening to you. But talk to us about that transition back into an operating executive role.
Yeah, look, each of these roles is different. I think it's important to be effective in these roles, whether it's a consultant, an advisor, a board member, an executive. You need to understand what the role is and how to adapt the style that you take, the approach you take to the role. But that adaptation needs to enable you to continue to be fully engaged, fully substantive, and value added in that role. I always wanted to be, whether I was walking into a boardroom as a Goldman Sachs banker or as a board member, I always wanted to be the most prepared. And I always asked myself just 1 or 2 questions on the way in. You didn't need to know everything in the 150-page deck you might be presenting or reading or discussing, but you needed to. I always tried. And look, a lot of my jobs, including the one I have right now, involve juggling a lot of balls and multitasking and trying to absorb a lot of information quickly and retain the parts that are most important. So whenever I read something or I'm preparing for a meeting, I ask myself a simple question, which is, what are the 3 or 4 critical questions, critical points that I need to think about going into this discussion and have a point of view on? It's not 100, It's not every page. It's not in the footnotes. What are the 3 or 4 critical things that are going to be discussed where my value add will be related to my ability to engage on this and to add perspective? And that's kind of how I go into every meeting. And so that's agnostic to whether you're an advisor, a board member, an executive. It's every role.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of mindset has really served me well in each of those roles.
All right. So last question. What, when you think of a fearless leader, which is one thing I try to instill in people, how would you define being a fearless leader?
So first of all, Brendan, I love the term, and I love the book you read built around that term. I know fearless leader is your eighth and final and maybe most important pillar. And I think it's a really, really important phrase. I think that fear is one of the great limiters of leadership potential. I think it's one of the great limiters of professional potential. And at some point early in my career at Goldman Sachs, I noticed a trend where when you were getting to that kind of seminal moment in a conversation, when you've been talking to the board or the CEO for 2 hours and then finally, he or she says, well, all right, well, I mean, just tell me, what do you think we should do? Often in a somewhat exasperated or intense tone. And all of a sudden the room would get really quiet. And I'd be like, well, isn't this the moment when people are supposed to step forward and say something, articulate a point of view, a train of logic? And so, I became comfortable sort of walking into that void early on in my career. And then I saw positive feedback from it, and it reinforced a desire to continue to do it. And so I think the first thing is don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to lose. And just be happy that you're in the discussion and competing. Everything's not going to go your way. Everyone's not going to agree with you, but learn from your setbacks. Honestly assess your strengths and weaknesses and work to improve both. Continuously learn. We've talked about that.
Yeah.
Right? When you see a problem, run to the problem. Don't run away from the problem. I mentioned earlier, feeling comfortable feels uncomfortable. Like if you're not pushing the edge a little bit for yourself personally, for your team, for the organization, you're probably not doing enough. Embrace the journey, not just the destination, and accept the uncertainty of not knowing how things will turn out. You have to just sort of accept that you may work at something for a very long time, and along the way, you are not going to know if you're going to get payback for it, recognition, whether it's going to turn out. And you have to just accept that uncertainty is part of the excitement of being on the journey. It's an opportunity. Billie Jean King, everyone sees it at the US Open every year, but that term, pressure is a privilege. Yeah. Pressure is a privilege. Not knowing how something's going to turn out, but having your contribution to it impact the outcome, being in that conversation is a privilege. All of these things are a privilege. I've always tried to broaden myself at every opportunity. The other thing I'd say around being a fearless leader, Brendan, is, early on in one's career, people often focus in a particular area of function, a specialty, they go deep, but the world is pretty long on people who are deep and narrow, and shorter on people who are deep enough, but also broad. And so I've always tried to think about, what is it I don't know something about? Where are my gaps? Where are my weaknesses? And what you find is that when complex problems come up for discussion, and by the way, most important problems are complex and there's no black and white answer, it's always gray. Having that breadth to be able to look across things you've seen, to look in seams, to connect a dot from a particular functional area to a different functional area. A lot of people in the room aren't doing that because they're narrower and deeper, not broader. And so I think that's something I've tried to teach myself about being fearless, is thinking about where are the gaps and again, continuously learning, but doing all this in a way that's authentic, honest, transparent. And you got to be willing to be vulnerable. You've got to be willing to fail. You got to be willing to be wrong. And I think if people see you in that light, they want to be along for the journey. And that creates, in a group setting, purpose. And so you may not be the leader of the group, but even being part of the group conducting yourself that way creates energy, purpose, excitement. And I think that's what fearlessness is when I think about that term.
That's great. So, all right. Hey, so to the crew out there listening, a few big takeaways today is, your journey on learning never ends. Here's somebody who had a successful career at IBM, successful career at Goldman, a successful board role at Delta, and he's still talking about learning in his role at Wheels Up. I think the second thing that I'd say to folks out there is play offense. I think George talked a lot about seizing moments today. He didn't say, woe is me, I moved 6 times and went to 6 schools. He talked about playing offense and learning from those different schools you attended. And when you went nights and weekends and summers to grad school, you didn't, drag yourself there going, I'm not going to the beach. I'm actually going to school. You took it as a chance to expand your network and go into a different industry and pivot. So I think what we can take away from you, George, is playing offense, and that you own your career, you own the outcome. And it's okay along the way to have some things that are uncomfortable and some stumbles and some challenges, and you're going to grow from that. So, hey, I just want to thank you, George, to our audience. Wheels Up, Chief Executive Officer, 4th largest private aviation company, building a different model than anybody else. So I'm confident we're going to see them going from 4th to 3rd and continuing to grow. Started his career at IBM as a sales executive, moved over into Goldman Sachs and was there for 20 years, served on boards, but a great resource to learn from. I know I've got a 1.5 pages of notes here right now of some things that I'm taking away. So George, thank you so much for your time today. And I know our audience is going to get a lot out of it.
Thank you, Brendan. Really appreciate you having me on.
This has been the Fearless Experience with Brendan P. Keegan. If you want to learn to live and lead fearlessly, go to brendanpkeegan.com.